Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, here's your host, Jason Day.
Welcome, friends, to the Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Day, and we have a fun and encouraging episode for you this week as I was joined by Reggie McNeal. Reggie has really helped shape the church leadership conversation over many years as a pastor, a denominational executive, as the missional specialist for Leadership Network, and now as a city coach with Good Cities, where he's helping build collaborative efforts across domains for kingdom impact. Reggie has written a number of best-selling books, including his most recent, entitled Kingdom Collaborators: 8 Signature Practices of Leaders Who Turn the World Upside Down. Now, on this week's episode, Reggie and I focus on the kingdom life and why it is critical for ministry leaders to shift their leadership. We discuss why our changing world means we need to view the church not as something to be fixed, but as something to be reimagined as we seek to effectively introduce people to Jesus and the beauty and adventure of his kingdom life. Reggie has such a generous and humble spirit. He shares so much wisdom. So please join me in this insightful conversation with Reggie McNeal. Reggie, I am so happy that you could join me today. Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast.
Oh, glad to be here, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, brother. Now, it's no secret that the world has changed a lot in the last few decades, right? The old paradigm of a pastor as one who sort of manages church life presents a bit of a disconnect with our current culture. And you're really encouraging, you've been encouraging us as pastors and ministry leaders for quite some time, but you're encouraging us to begin looking really at a new way of leading that you refer to as kingdom collaborators. And I got to tell you, I just love that term. And
cool.
We'll get more into how that is lived out in a moment here in our conversation. But before we do you sense that the majority of pastors are already somewhat behind in making this shift?
Well, I would have to say that our training and our experience hasn't positioned us to be on the front edge of this movement. How can I say it that way? Because I don't want maybe your listener to feel that being judged. But I would have to say that if you're with it and if you're into this new world, then you are you're having to work really hard to do it because it's not natural. Based on because all of our training, so many of the metaphors that shape the narrative that are in our heads that play to what it means to pastor and all that all comes out of a previous world that's gone.
Yeah, no, that's good. I love the way that you say that, and it's very gracious because, again, a lot of us are just operating out of, how we have been trained and what we have learned, and yet culture is shifting. So I love that you emphasize this idea of kingdom, right? Because it's a beautiful thing. Jesus made it very clear that was the emphasis. Let's dig in a bit about kingdom. Why is the idea of kingdom so necessary for leaders to be most effective in ministry today?
Well, I think if you want to be aligned with what God's major agenda is, then you have to be kingdom-minded. Now, I have to tell you, I didn't grow up. That was not part of my training. Hey, I'm a pastor's kid. I was in church, every Sunday 9 months before I was born. And so, I'm deep in the belly of the beast here. But I can just say that kingdom was not an idea that was prevalent, at least in my tradition. We sang a few children's songs about it and, learned seek first the kingdom, that kind of stuff. But really, kingdom was almost like it was not a dominant theme. Church was the dominant theme, church narrative. And so it took a long time for me to finally realize that the kingdom is God's major activity on planet Earth. See, I grew up thinking that the church was. And that, for God so loved the church that he gave his only begotten son, and that, and seek first the church, and I've come to give you more church and give it. And so it's not that I'm against the church. It's just that is a limited notion. The church is a part of the bandwidth, but is not the full bandwidth of God's work on planet Earth. His kingdom is.
Yeah, that's good. Reggie, I'm just curious, why do you think that kingdom wasn't emphasized as much in the church?
Yeah, Yeah, I think it's a result of the particularly the last 500 years of focus since the Reformation on getting the church fixed, getting it right.
Right.
We've been pretty obsessed with that, actually. I mean, ecclesiology has been the dominant theme. I mean, so all the book, who gets to do what and when and what, and whose authority, and can they wear a skirt or I mean, just on and on and on. And so there's been this what separates us from each other, which has forced a bit of tribal and church centricity into our thinking. So we prepare to manage that tribe or that church, that assignment. And like I say, even the seminary education and everything that comes out of the modern education system was post-Reformation. And so it has equipped us to manage, to lead and to manage the church that exists or to improve that. So I think the kingdom just kind of got a back seat in that regard. The larger agenda just kind of just didn't get the attention that the more more readily in front of me assignment does, which is how do I do my church job?
Right. So why do you think there has been this fresh look at the idea of kingdom, and why is that coming into so much of what we talk about and how we minister, and why has this kind of sprouted up at this time?
Well, Jason, it's a great question. I was recently speaking to a group of Lutheran pastors that so happened to be, and so I told them, I said, how's you Lutherans been working on fixing the church for 500 years. How's that going for you? And I don't know why they think they own the Reformation. But the point is that the Reformation was powered in many ways by the third information revolution in human history. I mean, the first was the invention of writing, the second, the book. Then you have the printing press, which enabled an entire new world. Each information revolution gives birth to an entire new world, a human experience. And it can take, 150 years for the implications of that to settle out in the larger culture in terms of institutions and all that. Well, so here we come along now, and we literally are in the first decades of the fourth human information revolution, the digital age.
Right.
And that's created an entire new world. I was telling those Lutheran pastors, look, relax. It's not your fault. I mean, this thing has caught all of us. And every institution is undergoing massive change. I mean, in my home last night, I had one of the leading people in the education in my state, and she was talking about fixing the system, and I just she's a friend, so I just had to say, I think that's the wrong question, because that system, the educational system, is anchored in an old world, is in the mass standardization world. We're now into mass customization through this fourth digital revolution. And so, that's just one example outside the church that you can point to. I mean, I don't know how old you are, Jason, but many of my listeners will remember a world where you didn't customize everything. I mean, I grew up with 3 TV stations. I had to buy 12 songs on a record to get one that I liked. I had to actually go to a bank into a movie theater to watch a movie. And even in my earliest days, go to a Pizza Hut to get a pizza. So, I mean, look what's happened now. Many of the folks that are listening to us say, I've got an app on my bank. I'm on my phone. I don't have to go to the bank to bank. I can suck the Library of Congress out of thin air in the smartphone that makes me feel stupid all the time. So here we are in this customization. The music industry, for instance, had to figure out how do you customize around folks so that folks can download the music they want when they want it and that kind of thing. So spiritually, the same dynamics are at play. People don't shift back to the other world in their spiritual life if they're used to customizing and building a world around them. then it works the same way in the spiritual world. And so the church as an institution, now not church as movement, but the church as institution has to figure out literally, and I'll just use that again, how to become church as movement, because that's what the fourth information revolution actually enables, a spiritual movement, not just institutional expressions of spiritual journeying.
That's good, Reggie. And I love what you said in there when you said you were talking with your friend about the educational system, because you said something that I think we all, as pastors, as ministers, need to kind of listen to. You said it wasn't so much that she had to fix the system. It's just that it's kind of a new world, and so you have to kind of figure out how to navigate in an entirely new space. And so that's that applies to the church as well. It's not necessarily that everything's bad, because we hear a lot of this, kind of back and forth. Right. It's not that everything's broken and bad. It's just a reality that, man, the world has changed, and we as ministry leaders need to recognize that and not kind of stick our head in the sand, but recognize that and then say, okay, then how are we God's people in a fresh new world? Exactly.
In other words, like to my friend last night, I said the better question, because you have to change questions so you can flip the narrative, so you can shape the narrative. The better question is not how do we fix our educational system. It's how do we prepare kids for their lives in this new world. You see, you have to recalibrate the question you're trying to answer in order to think differently. Same thing in the church. We can say, how do we build great churches? Or we can actually think the church is primarily a movement in the world of God's people. So maybe the better question is, how do we develop viral kingdom agents who in their life, if you want to call that discipleship, if you want to call it, but really we're talking about developing people who view life as a mission trip, not their spiritual journeying as something separate from everything else in their life, but is an integrative force, and they become kingdom agents and gospel bearers, in every aspect of their life. So that's a different recalibration of the question that I think would help free up a lot of, it would help us think in maybe some other categories besides how can we get it would change the scorecard for sure. Instead of just how many people do we have on Sunday and those kind of things, which everyone laments to me. Or many people, unless their numbers happen to go up, they like that scorecard. But for so many of our pastors, Jason, they are caught in a losing proposition because the number of people who are susceptible to being congregationalized in our culture is a dwindling number. And they are it's like they're being asked to play a game with a scorecard where they know they're going to, at the end of the day, most of them are going to lose. Well, how motivating is that?
Right.
And so I just think not as some kind of a magical ruse to get out from being accountable for what we do. I just think the scorecard is way too limited with tagged to the church as institution. Now, tagged to church as movement, now we're back into kingdom stuff, which was the question you asked 1,000 years ago. And it's taken me this long to get to it. Can you imagine now why my books are as long as they are? So, because the kingdom is the end game. I mean, it is the game. It's about life. And church is supposed to contribute. Our church experience is supposed to contribute to that. It's not like the kingdom is a subset of church activity. Church is a subset of, kingdom agenda.
Right.
And so it's really how are we preparing people to live as viral kingdom agents 24/7 so that, and honestly, most of what's impacting their life and is happening away from church settings, unless we get this kingdom notion in our heads, fully developed. And that's why I work really hard at trying to describe the kingdom as life, and with the caveat of life as God intends. I mean, it's all about life. We start the Bible, we've done some stuff to kingdom, and that's why maybe I should say, I think we have to get out of our heads so much of the stuff that we think about earthly kingdoms. I think Jesus made it pretty plain to Pontius Pilate, my kingdom's not of this world. I mean, we don't need to take earthly kingdoms and hammer the heavenly kingdom back into our earthly kingdom archetypes.
Right.
We do have that archetype in our mind, but it's a transcendent notion. It's different from what we experience here. We open the Bible in a garden, and in the middle of the garden, in the center, is the tree of life. That's not incidental.
Yeah.
And God sends an angel to stand guard over that tree when Eden is disintegrating. You fast forward to the end of the book, and you're in a city, and running through the middle of the city is the river of life, trees of life planted on both sides that never go out of season. Jesus in the middle of the book says, I'm the way, the truth, the life. And just in case we miss it, I've come to give you life, abundant life. So it seems to me the kingdom is about the life that God intends, and the kingdom story is the extent that God will go to make sure that people have access to that life, even to the extent you and I are recording this podcast in early December here. We're fixing to celebrate a time of year where we actually commemorate the fact that God stepped into our world, put on flesh to live out in front of us what kingdom life looks like. I mean, how Jesus moved around, what he did, how he did it, all of that stuff is important, not just the words that fell out of his mouth, but his entire life was an example of what the kingdom is.
Yeah,
and that's so powerful.
That's beautiful. The whole idea of kingdom. I love how you bring kingdom and life together, because I think that is an important understanding. Because, like you said, we can define kingdom in a lot of different ways, and sometimes we get caught up in that because we're stuck in the idea of earthly kingdom and somehow fitting God's kingdom into that. So a couple of times you've mentioned this, and I'd love for us to touch on this so that you can share this distinction that you make between church as an institution and church as a movement. Can you share with us a little bit about the difference there?
Well, first of all, I don't want it to be, I don't mean to, let's say it this way, I don't mean to use church as institution in a pejorative way, although a lot of people hear it that way, and I guess I'm trying to separate out, because every movement calcifies and over time and has institutional expression to it, and church as institution is a real thing. I mean, it exists. I mean, behind me, outside my office here, there's a big old honking church with a steeple on top of it. And that says there's something substantive that happens. So the Christendom, all of that stuff that we associate with Christianity particularly, has institutional expression. And it's not all evil. It's just, it's more religious, because a lot of it, has been devised by human beings to process people's experience of their spiritual journey inside of a Christian, quote unquote, worldview and pilgrimage. Now, church as movement is all the way back to the viscera. It's the relational aspect where, frankly, first century believers, even before they're called Christians, would understand what it means to be church. For them, it was a relationship. In fact, they wouldn't even understand our language when we say go to church or don't miss church, because church for them was a way of being, more than a noun or destination. It wasn't a place. It wasn't a set of programs. It wasn't a bunch of religious deliverables that we come to expect, transactionally. If we were part of this, we ought to get this for it. No, church was their relationship with Jesus. and what he established, which was a kingdom outpost and in the world.
And just to kind of flesh out a little bit more, when we're talking about this idea of being a kingdom collaborator or a kingdom leader, that can occur both within church as an institution and church as a movement?
Absolutely, because all of our life is being lived out inside of a kingdom purview,
Right.
And in fact, sometimes to further help people, I guess, with the difference between institution and church's movement. My marriage, for instance, I'm married to Kathy. We've been married 37 years. There's never a time, no matter where I am, so there's never a time or a place that I'm not Kathy McNeal's husband.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I have institutionalized that through a marriage, but my gosh, it's a way of being. It's not just something I signed off on.
Right.
I mean, I'm still husbanding. There are things I do because I'm married to Kathy. There are things I don't do because I'm married to Kathy. I mean, she's always influencing the conversation. I mean, she's talking to me right now while I'm talking to you. I mean, she's inside my head.
Right.
She's saying, don't say that. Or you better back up and go for that again. I mean, the point is, that's the way it is with being a Jesus follower. Being church that's what I mean by it being more a verb.
Right.
It's a way of being in this world, not a place or something that I go to do certain things. So I church at home. I church in the neighborhood, just like I husband at home. I husband in the neighborhood. I husband through, different, all aspects of my life in different kinds of ways, because I'm never not husbanding in terms of that relationship that's always there. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, that's good.
Is that, even if Jesus doesn't come up in all of our conversations, he's always influencing our conversations. He's in touch with it. I mean, if we're, listening and leaning in and paying attention, I mean, there's never a time you catch me that I'm somehow disconnected from that relationship.
Right. No, that's good. Now, Reggie, as a majority of people listening are pastors and ministry leaders, a lot of them more likely feel themselves, as operating within the church as an institution.
Right.
And sometimes that feels, especially when your heart's captured by the kingdom, sometimes
Right.
church as institution can feel a little bit like it's constraining kind of that kingdom life. So,
yes.
So what would you say to those pastors that kind of feel themselves in that tension, not the idea of kind of jettisoning, church as an institution, but how do we move into and step into that kingdom leadership, that kingdom life in that situation? You
have really articulated this so well, because most of the folks I work with do in fact have very responsible jobs inside the church as an institution, either congregational pastors or leaders or leaders of an entire denomination or a region, whatever. Mm-hmm. And so what I tell them is, I think it's critical that we actually live into this tension, that we not sublimate when our hearts leap around kingdom, like as you just said. There's a reason for that. We need to pay attention to that. And so every pastor that I'm working with in any kind of consulting or coaching way or whatever, I'm trying to help them figure out how to bring their ministry and their church or whatever their responsibilities, their organization, to be more kingdom-centric, to have more of a kingdom agenda, because it's life-giving to them. I mean, there's a reason, the church as institution can leave you pretty burned out. But every pastor that I know that's really leaning into kingdom life is being renewed, because the kingdom is life. Now, Jason, I have to say there's some strategies about that. It's not you wake up one morning and you decide to go this way, and everyone around you is going to, fall in line and follow along.
Wouldn't that be nice?
It requires, yeah, right. It requires some very intentional shifts in three areas, actually. First of all, we have to shift the story. By that, I mean, what's the narrative that we're working out of? And I can tell you the kingdom narrative is much more robust and powerful than a church-centric narrative. Just today, I received a year-end report from a friend who wanted me to see what he's thinking, and he's kind of giving his churches an update. And unfortunately, as I read through that, and as he's positioning for the future, his language is all still about what goes on at the corner of 3rd and Main and all of the programs there and what they look like and their health, as if these programs, is what Jesus died for. I mean, it's craziness to me. We've got to shift the storyline. There's a much bigger story. God wants a better life for people in our community. So you can no longer just pastor a congregation. You could do that in a previous iteration where the world was just divvied up into, you are the curator of souls for this area, this zip code, or this village, or whatever. We've got to get back to some of that, quite honestly, recapture that. I don't just lead this organization. I have a responsibility of kingdom life in the community where I am. And so you have to change the narrative. And by the way, that has implications for what we talk about when we come together to worship, when we gather on a weekend. And I mean, again, when I do hand-to-hand combat, deep consulting, we take a look at how many times do we do stuff like, pray for our leaders, pray for our community. How often do we hear from a community leader? How much of our stuff is just about, we get in here and shut out the world and just, go into some kind of a, quasi-trance mode just to worship, because I've been told, you see, from my early days, shut out the world, focus on God here, and God is screaming at the top of his lungs. Wait a minute, I don't shut out the world. That's not what I've called you to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's time where you won't have the world to worry about, but right now you're on mission.
Right.
And so, I want you to get on your heart what's on my heart. So anyway, so we look at everything from I remember starting a consult. We just pulled up the website of the church, and there were 2 stories of folks that had recently become members, and God got mentioned once, Jesus not at all. But there was heavy emphasis on, how friendly everyone was, and the valet parking, and and the coffee, and I'm not kidding.
Wow.
So that's a different narrative,
right?
Than a narrative that celebrates what the King, for crying out loud, is up to, in the world. And so let's get with that. So you have to change the story. You have to change the scorecard. We've already talked about that just a little bit. So what would that look like? Well, that's a customized. You see, in the age of mass standardization, every denomination, every church, we knew what the scorecard was. How many folks? How often do they come? How much money do they bring? How many folks? Just on and on and on. Well, in a kingdom, maybe you're trying to have fewer hungry people in your community, or maybe more kids that can read, so that their life is not a living hell because they can't get a job and everything else that goes along with that. Or maybe you're trying to rescue folks from sex trafficking. I mean, there are a whole variety of ways that you can figure out what your impact on a community is as you decide what it is, and how many hours your folks are doing, community service and loving their neighbor. I mean, how do we, when does that ever get brought into the equation?
Right.
How's that loving your neighbor thing going? And so it seemed to be important to Jesus. But, and then the third thing, and I know this is not designed to be a consult here, but just to show you how intentional you have to be, you have to also finally change the story and the scorecard, but you have to change the stewardship of the leaders. In the old world, how are we doing at managing the church? In the new world, how are we doing? Yes, to the first one, you don't quit that. But there's a bit more of a leadership agenda when you think about what God is up to just right outside the door of your, institutional expression right across the street, maybe maybe right next door to you. What is the agenda that God wants the leaders? And to your point, that's helping. Part of that agenda ought to be, how are we helping people with their life game? I mean, if you look at the church service as the game, then you really miss the point, because the church gathering is kind of like halftime.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the game is like, no one plays a football game so you can have halftime.
Right.
And no one comes out of the halftime saying, it doesn't matter if we're winning or losing, but boy, that coach gave an inspiring talk. You just can't believe we're on a 6-week series that the coach is doing, and man, the music was phenomenal and all. I mean, are you kidding? I mean, you at halftime you do whatever it is so you can play the game. I mean, you don't gauge the game by the quality of halftime. So I just think we just got to recalibrate so much in our minds in order to get back at it. And by the way, the folks that are under our leadership, in our leadership constellation, they're not evil. A lot of times it's like, well, they'll never let me do this, and our folks are so good. Hey, they're only doing what we've told them to do for 500 years, for crying out loud.
Right.
So I mean, let's don't decide that folks that don't think like this are automatically against it. It's the job of the leader to bring folks along.
That's excellent, Reggie. So how would you recommend, as we're looking at Kingdom Collaborators, your newest book, there are these 8 different kind of characteristics of a leader who is kind of living into this kingdom collaboration. And as we're talking about these kind of shifts, how would you recommend a pastor at just a regular church who has this heart for kingdom, but his church is kind of steeped in, like you said, what we've taught them to do for the last 500 years.
Right.
What would you recommend? And I know you can't go through a full consultation, but what would you recommend as some first steps to a pastor who might be listening right now and his heart is moved? What would be some good first steps?
I think I would ask God to help me figure out 4 or 5 leaders who have major leadership roles in the community. Now, they may not be the chair of your deacons or elders or whatever. In fact, they may not even be that engaged in the church. And there may be a good reason for that.
Right.
And there may be multiple reasons for that. I think I would say, Lord, who are 4 or 5 folks that have leadership in our community that I could convene, and maybe us begin to talk about these practices of how we can be kingdom leaders, because these folks have significant influence, and I want to affirm that and help them. So I think that's probably, and I'll tell you, out of those discussions and out of the heart of that, when you begin to talk with those leaders about how they can, we'll just take a few of these, how they can pray with one eye open as they, are a hospital administrator or school administrator or a physician or whatever, and how can they foment dissatisfaction with status quo stuff that's keeping people from living the life that God intends. And I don't mean holding evangelistic crusades at break time, and at the office, but how can they begin to just, begin to be these kingdom agents in a viral way? I think that would be a very rich and robust conversation that, frankly, most pastors don't have, because the responsibility we have, our typical conversations when we get people together is how they can help the church out.
That's so good, Reggie.
I just think it would be a journey. We've got to become learners. into this new world. And I think it's okay for pastors I want to affirm, if you're feeling ill-equipped, hey, that's the beginning of wisdom.
Right.
I mean, it's okay to be a learner. And I think it could be a very exciting and liberating, a liberating journey.
That's awesome, brother. Man, I so loved hearing your heart and really encouraging words. If those listening, the pastors, ministry leaders listening, wanted to connect with you or learn more about Kingdom Collaborators, how could they do that?
Well, I suspect, email's always good. I have a couple of email addresses, reggie.mcneal@leadnet.org. I'm still I call it a senile fellow at Leadership Network. They call it a senior fellow. They're kinder. I work with Good Cities as my primary kind of corporate work now, working with groups. So that's Reggie at goodcities.net. And at Good Cities, we're engaging groups of people, leaders who really want to build cross-domain collaboratives. I hate to use all these code words, but really they actually want to do something so their community's better. How's that?
Yeah.
And so we help them figure out what can those initiatives be, and how could they be successful at moving the needle on stuff all the way from health issues to literacy to that kind of stuff. So Reggie at goodcities.net would go there. Probably those two ways would be just as good as any.
Excellent, brother. Excellent. Man, I just thank you for taking your time, for sharing your heart and what you continue to be learning. You talk about a lifelong learner, Reggie. You continue to be digging in. And the beautiful thing is then you share all that you uncover with us. So we certainly appreciate that and all that you do for the kingdom, my friend.
Thanks, Jason. Man, it's been great to talk with you today.
I appreciate you taking the time to be with us on this week's episode. Every week as we are putting the episodes together, we're thinking of you, our pastors and ministry leaders, and striving to provide insightful and inspiring interviews as you seek to grow as a kingdom leader. So we hope you're finding value from the Church Leaders podcast, and if so, we'd certainly appreciate you taking a few moments to head over to iTunes and leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders more easily find our podcasts so they too can benefit from these interviews. Again, we thank you in advance, and if you have any comments, any questions, suggestions, or ideas for guests, I would love to hear from you. You can send me an email to podcast@churchleaders.com, or you can connect with me on Twitter. Finally, you can find this podcast as well as other great faith-based podcasts on the FaithPlay app. It's available for both Apple and Android, and so we encourage you to check that out as well. So until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.